إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Now welcome to our next episode, the sixth episode with regards to Islam in Asia. Again, as I mentioned before, Islam in Africa does not mean that one episode is good enough. And Islam in Asia, the sixth episode, is definitely not one episode only worth it for 10-15 minutes, obviously, to discuss the history of Islam in Asia, as we could not discuss the history of Islam in Asia in 10-15 minutes. However, what we're trying to do is trying to look into the general aspect of it. How did Islam spread in Africa? How did it spread in Asia? How did it spread in the Americas? Is it all true what we have learned until now? Is it really like this, that Muslims went to the Americas through migration? Basically, Islam went to America through migration. As we have seen, is not entirely true. The Muslims, many Muslims even had been to the Americas before, long before the Europeans had ever arrived there. We have seen that in Africa, and we will see the same also in Asia. Asia is, of course, the biggest continent in the world, with massive countries such as China, India, and the whole Asian part of Russia. Massive countries, huge populations, the biggest in the world, China and India. Amongst them, also population of Muslims. India actually having the biggest population of Muslims in the world, but it's a minority. As well as the Muslims in China are a minority. Now, China has made the news recently because of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, as the Chinese call it Xinjiang, East Turkestan. This video is sponsored by the 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬 program. For nearly 7 centuries, Ibn Khaldoun's 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬 has been read and studied by scholars and students of history, sociology, politics and economics as the single most authoritative and astounding work of classical scholarship in the field of history. Embark on an enlightening educational venture led by Muslim scholars and teachers delving into Islamic history, sociology, economics and beyond. Engage with cutting-edge learning cues and multimedia components, allowing for a deeper understanding of the topics. Distinguish between the lies and the truths of the narratives told, between reliable and unreliable sources. Equip yourself with the skills to conduct deep research and build confidence to combat Islamophobia. Come and strengthen your Muslim identity today. Grab the course in the video description. Where they're persecuted and persecuted as an ethnic minority as well as a religious minority. But China has to be seen has a very big history with regards to the Muslims and Islam. It has actually always been open to the Muslims, and Islam could spread in China easily throughout the last couple of centuries, throughout different dynasties. But if we look back into China quickly, we see that during the 7th up to the 10th century, so around 300 years, 3 to 4 centuries, the Tang dynasty that was ruling China at the time had successful diplomatic relationships, economic expansion, and a cosmopolitan culture, where it included also the Muslims at that time. Many envoys from India, Persia, Arabia, Syria, Korea, and Japan thronged the streets of Chang'an, the capital, and foreign tongues were a common part of daily life of the Tang dynasty China. So the time that Islam actually developed in the 7th century developed also in China. So pretty much at the very beginning, between 616 and 618, the Sahaba Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who was one of the 10 who was promised Jannah, and others were sent as an official envoy to the Chinese Emperor Gaozong during Caliph Othman's reign in 651, because he had been to that area before and knew how to deal with the Chinese ruler. 845, this is an important year to mention, there was the anti-Buddhist edict, where the government or the ruling dynasty at that time went against Buddhist activities, and nothing about Islam was mentioned at that time. Muslim traders and merchants in the port cities of Guangzhou and Hangzhou in the southeast, but also in Chang'an, in Kaifeng and Yangzhou in the interior, especially in the Song dynasty, were moving freely. So there was no issue of the Muslim traders and merchants, doing their business. No problem at all. In the city of Guangzhou, one could find 4 mosques and the grave of Saad's father with the famous 𝗘𝗜𝗦𝗟𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬 mosque built by Saad ibn Abi Waqqas, the one we mentioned before, mashallah, Sahabi. So 4 mosques that time in the 9th century could be found in the city of Guangzhou. So Islam started getting more established and more accepted in that part of the world. During the Song dynasty, which was from 960 to 1279, Muslims had become an established element in Chinese trade, and the office of Director General of Shipping was consistently held by a Muslim during this period. Okay? More than 5,000 Muslims from Bukhara, from Uzbekistan, were invited to settle first in China's northeast and then between the Song capital of Kaifeng and Yanqing, which is today Beijing. Their leader, Prince Amir Said, is called the father of the Chinese Muslims. This is during the time of the Song dynasty. We're talking about the 10th to the 13th century. In the 13th century, now, what happens now is between 1271 and 1368, the Yuan dynasty rules, which is the first non-Chinese Mongol dynasty. So the Mongols subjugated for the first time the Chinese, and China became part of the vast Mongol Empire. The Mongols gave foreign immigrants a special status and privileges over the Han Chinese. So the average Chinese, the non-Muslim Chinese, and the Han Chinese, the non-Muslim Chinese, and the Muslim Chinese were now clearly divided. The Mongols preferred the Muslims over the Han Chinese. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim immigrants, Persians, Arabs, Uyghurs, were recruited and forcibly relocated by the Mongols to help them administer their quickly expanding empire. They were generally known as Semu, various eye color, and headed many corporations in China during the time. Muslim scholars were employed as architects, astronomers, and more. So if we can see there already that I can imagine personally that a Han Chinese, a non-Muslim, would consider a Muslim Chinese due to being given a special position and role in China by the Mongols. I can imagine that there was, of course, a lot of envy, hatred, and jealousy that developed during that time. A bit further into the next dynasty, the Ming dynasty, in the 14th to the 17th century, which is considered the golden age of Islam in China, Islam and mosques were during that time flourishing in the capital cities Beijing and Nanjing, as well as in Yunnan, Fujian, and Guangdong. Muslims were influencing the government, while the founder of the Ming dynasty was surrounded by Muslim generals. 6 of his most trusted generals were Muslims. And that time during the Ming dynasty, as we said, until the 17th century, there were very famous Chinese Muslims that we even know nowadays. For example, the famous Chinese Muslim and explorer Zheng He. Zheng He, he led 7 expeditions to the Indian Ocean, and from 1405 to 1433. So these Muslims brought Chinese outside of China as well, explored the outside world, and made Islam basically part of China, without a doubt. But the way it develops later, we're entering the 16th, 17th, 18th century, when racial policy towards ethnic minorities was rather assimilationist through forced marriages. Muslims were allowed to practice Islam, but if they were members of other ethnic groups, they were required by law to intermarry. So Hui had to marry. The Hui Muslims had to marry basically non-Muslim Chinese, and that of course assimilated the Muslims heavily into Chinese culture and Chinese civilization. The Muslims in China from early immigration began to assimilate by speaking Chinese dialects and by adopting Chinese names and culture. New immigration to China was restricted, and the policy became more isolationist. So we have reached now the 17th and 18th century, where we see that things changed drastically. And when we come closer to the 20th century with the Cultural Revolution of the communists, there forget totally the issue of religion, and not only Islam, but any religion was actually frowned upon, discriminated against, many temples, many mosques were destroyed. Muslims could not move freely in China. This is the more modern part of Islam during the time of communism. Nowadays, in the 21st century, there is a kind of revival of Islam, but however, as we said before, the problems that the Muslims in the Xinjiang province face are more political than religious. But religion plays a role there. They misuse, they abuse actually the situation that these are Muslims. They don't allow them to fast in Ramadan. They actually don't allow them to pray properly. There are issues, mosques have been destroyed, and all these issues that have become actually news nowadays in that we can follow nowadays in the news. And it is quite disturbing to see how a country like China, you know, from being so open and allowing the Muslims to participate, to become part of China, nowadays have nothing to do in China. It's like they feel like a foreign body there. As we saw in China, how Islam went to China through 𝗘𝗔𝗥𝗡 ibn Waqqas and other Sahabi. They went there basically and spread Islam. There was no fights and no battles. Also Indonesia and Malaysia, the biggest country, the biggest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, the biggest Muslim population in the world, accepted Islam through trade. Again, no swords, no battles, no fighting, no bloodshed. Very simple, just to explain it simply, what happened with Indonesia. Arab traders or Muslim traders from the Arab world are not only used to trade with Indonesians and with Asians in general, and the Indonesians would just see how honest and how positive they were, these Muslims were, and how they were treating the non-Muslims, and many of them would just simply accept Islam. That's how simple it was basically. Indonesia became Muslim, the Indonesians became Muslim simply through trade. Not only, as we saw, most of the world actually accepted Islam through trade. Trade was the main activity of the Muslims at that time. Muslim merchants, Muslim traders, of course, all over the world. Now, the same in India. India, massive country, and with India, we mean actually the whole Indian subcontinent, so from Pakistan all the way down, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka. Islam arrived there already in 615 AD, in northeast India, through the Silk Route. We should not forget the Silk Route played an important role, because the Silk Route transported not only trade, not only goods from one part of Asia into Europe, to the other part of Asia and into Europe, but also culture, civilization, and of course Islam. So mashallah, also to India, Islam went by trade, and trade made many Indians nowadays what we know as Muslims nowadays, which is a massive population of Muslims. With regards to the south, to the province of Kerala, for example, southern India, the Sahabas, for example, went there by ships, and they preached there. So basically they again spoke to Indians in the south of India, so in the north through the Silk Road, in the south through by ships. So they went there, and the first mosque in India was built in 629 in the south, in Malabar actually. In the south of India was built in 629, so in the province, in Kerala, in the province of Malabar. Islam was founded in Sindh, the province of Sindh, which is nowadays Pakistan, in 711. So 711, the same time that 𝗘𝗥𝗡 ibn arrives in Gibraltar, in what is nowadays Spain, in al-Andalus, and that's the time that Islam was founded already in Pakistan in 711. The Delhi Sultanate was established in 1208 AD. Just to mention an important issue with regards to India, there is the issue of the 𝗑𝗏𝗟𝗏 family. The 𝗑𝗏𝗏 family were early supporters. They became Muslim. They came from Hindu background. They had a Hindu background. They accepted Islam, and they were early supporters of the Abbasid revolt against the Umayyads. Now, there was a time in the 8th century when the Umayyads were ruling, but the Abbasids take over the rule from the Umayyads. They killed basically, they massacred the Umayyads without a doubt. They massacred them, and some Umayyads fled to al-Andalus that time and established an Umayyad empire in al-Andalus. And the Abbasids were basically the revolutionaries against the Umayyads. Now, so these Abbasids were supported by the 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗡 family, which was an Indian family. Important to mention this family simply because they were patrons of the sciences, which greatly helped the propagation of Indian science and scholarship from the neighboring academy of Gundi Shupar into the Arabic world. They patronized scholars such as 𝗘𝗜𝗦𝗟𝗧𝗢𝗥𝗬 and Jabir ibn Bukhtishu. They are also credited with the establishment of the first paper mill in Baghdad. The power of the 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗡s in those times is reflected in the book of 1001 Nights, the famous one. The vizier Ja'far appears in several stories, as well as a tale that gave rise to the expression Barmecide feast. Again, I forgot to mention this before, but from China the Muslims took the compass and brought it to Europe. From India, they took many other things, as well as papyrus, for example, as well as many things that were not known at that time. And the India and China and Indian and Chinese civilization played an important role for the Muslims to integrate this part of civilization into the Islamic civilization, as long as the framework was not, as long as it didn't go out of the framework. And this is something important I would like to mention. We should not forget, nowadays we have Muslims who tell you that you cannot take anything from non-Muslim cultures. This is not entirely true. Our ancestors showed us that actually with taking from other nations and peoples such as Chinese and the Indians, they actually developed Islam further, and there was nothing wrong with it. Many Chinese and Indians accepted Islam and realized that Islam is pure and positive, as well as the Muslims of that time had a framework which was very, very big, and it was not very tiny and small as many Muslims nowadays. So they looked further, they looked ahead. So mashallah, there is nothing wrong again for us all to understand that we can take from non-Muslim cultures as long as they are within the framework of Islam. And that means we need to understand our framework, and that's what we learn from our history as well. We need to understand how big, that our framework is quite big as Muslims. That goes together with knowledge about Islam and knowledge about the world. So with these end words, mashallah, we're finishing this episode, and jazakumullahu khair again for your interest, and again, massive an episode of the massive continent of Asia, which of course we could not go too deep into, but at least it scratched the surface and gave you an idea, especially of the two countries, China and India, which gave the Muslim world and Islam, actually the Muslims, a lot of their civilization and their culture, which made the Muslims also big. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.